The cell read 4 degrees Kelvin above the kill threshold when I opened the inner door, and the human was doing push-ups. I stood in the doorway for a moment longer than I should have. I am not a sentimental official. I have run Veth containment station Kolvar 9 for 11 years. I have processed 2,200 detainees across 14 species. I am the sort of administrator who files addenda at shift end, who cross-indexes incident logs without being asked. I take pride in that nothing inside my station has ever surprised me. The human was doing push-ups. I checked the panel at my side. Cell ambient, 6.1 degrees Celsius. The cell had been cycled down 17 hours prior under Protocol Terath, our passive reduction procedure. It is not listed as a termination protocol in the formal registry. It is listed as a sustained environmental compliance measure. 18 species have been cycled under Protocol Terath. In the 11 years I have run this station, none of them were doing push-ups at hour 17. I entered the cell. The cold hit the exposed cartilage around my eyes immediately. I registered a mild contraction reflex. The human looked up at me from the floor, arms extended in the down position of the exercise, and said nothing. She was sweating, not perspiring in the mild stress response way that some warm-blooded species do, sweating. There was a visible sheen across her forehead, along her upper arms, across the back of her neck. The droplets had fallen to the floor in a narrow radius around her and had frozen there. Small flat discs of ice arranged in a perfect oval beneath her body. She had been warm enough for long enough to sweat in a cell held at 6 degrees. I told her to stand. She stood. I noted her respiration, slightly elevated the way any creature's would be during sustained physical exertion, nothing more. Color in her face, normal. Lip color, normal. Not the pale blue that indicates core temperature compromise. She was not shivering. She looked at me the way a person looks at an official who has interrupted a training session, mildly inconvenienced. I told her to extend her arms. Did. I held a contact thermometer to the inside of her wrist. The instrument read 37.1 degrees Celsius at her skin surface. Ambient was 6.1. The differential between her skin and the surrounding air was 31 degrees. In 11 years of managing this station, I had never recorded a surface temperature differential of more than 14 in any living detainee, and that was a harak, a species with a famously aggressive metabolic response to cold. The harak had been shivering violently. The human was not. I told her to sit. I went to file the report. What I wrote in that first incident summary, I will confess now, was not entirely accurate. I noted the anomaly. I noted the cell temperature and the contact reading and the differential. But I attributed it, in my own framing, to instrument error. I ordered a recalibration of Cell Block 3's ambient sensors, and told myself the story was over. The story was not over. 3 days later, under entirely different circumstances, a routine transfer requiring physical escort through the station's lower corridor, standard procedure for a detainee rated Class 2, no elevated risk notation. 2 of my guards and a 3rd officer from the receiving block made physical contact with the human over the course of approximately 4 minutes of corridor transit. Contact. A standard 2-point arm escort. 1 officer per arm, plus the receiving officer who processed the transfer intake and held the detainee's forearm for the biometric scan. 2 escort officers reported to the medical bay that afternoon. Skin contact. 1 of them had been holding the human's upper arm for approximately 90 seconds. His grip had required removal within 48 hours, treated for surface-level cold contact injury, the paradox being that he was cold and the human was, measurably, not. Later described the sensation as holding a heated surface, a slow build, from warmth, to something his skin cells could not tolerate. He had not registered it as pain immediately. He had registered it as proximity to a heat source. His body had begun pulling blood from the contact surface after 30 seconds, a standard thermal protection reflex. At 90 seconds, the dermal layer of his palm had begun to show stress markers. At 2 minutes and 12 seconds, he had unconsciously shifted his grip twice without understanding why. He thought there was something wrong with his hand. There was nothing wrong with his hand. The problem was what he had been holding. The receiving officer who processed intake. Contact duration approximately 40 seconds. Forearm only, presented with mild hypoperfusion in the contact fingers. Not severe. He was back on rotation the next morning, but he filed a note, and the note reached my desk. And I pulled the escort officer's medical record, and I sat for some time reading the numbers. 7 degrees at the skin surface. In a 6-degree cell after 17 hours. Sustained across a 3-day hold with no change in reading. No dietary intake to account for metabolic loading. No exercise recorded during the escort period. Just 37 degrees, constant, radiating outward at a differential that my officers' bodies had read correctly as a heat hazard. I requested a formal thermal assessment, not from the station medical staff, from the Veth Institute of Comparative Biology, sector branch. I am not a biologist. I wanted people who were. The assessment team arrived 8 days later. 3 researchers, lead assessor Dr. Omath Tuvril, 2 junior associates. I had the human brought to the station's clinical examination suite, a room I use for contested detainee health evaluations, with better lighting and better instruments than the medical bay. Tuvril set up a thermal imaging array, the kind used for large subject metabolic, and asked me to leave the room. I did not leave the room. I stood against the back wall and watched. What the array showed was this: the human, seated in a standard exam chair, was producing and radiating thermal energy at a continuous rate that Tuvril's instruments had to recalibrate twice to confirm, because the initial readings were flagged as instrument saturation. Flagged, as if the machine did not believe the numbers. Tuvril ran the calibration, ran it again. Looked at the numbers, looked at the human. The human looked back. The metabolic thermal output was not abnormal for a human. Tuvril told me this later carefully, with the particular precision of a scientist, choosing each word before releasing it. A human body at rest produces approximately 80 watts of thermal energy. In exertion, significantly more. The human body does not merely generate this heat. It manages it, radiates it, expels it through a surface cooling system that is, when you examine it from the outside, a kind of continuous low-grade broadcast. They are, in a meaningful physiological sense, warm-blooded in the most literal interpretation of that phrase. Their blood runs warm, their skin runs warm, their exhalation is warm, their hands are warm, they are furnaces wearing skin. This is not remarkable on a warm planet, in a temperate atmosphere, surrounded by other creatures with similar thermoregulation. This is remarkable in a 6-degree cell. This is remarkable when your guards are a species, Veth, whose thermoregulatory system is, by evolutionary design, primarily passive. We do not generate heat. We conserve it. Our bodies are excellent at maintaining a stable internal temperature in temperate conditions, and appalling, doing so when the thermal gradient runs the wrong direction. We are built for environments where the ambient temperature is close to or above our own. Place a Veth in a 6-degree cell, and we begin to struggle within 4 hours. At hour 8, core temperature decline is clinically significant. At hour 17, we are in medical distress. Place a human in a 6-degree cell and she does push-ups. I asked Tuvril what would happen if Veth were in close physical proximity to a human for an extended period in a cold environment. He was quiet for a moment before answering. He said, "Proximity would help the Veth. The human's thermal output in cold conditions is, relative to the Veth's passive thermal needs, significant. A Veth near a human in the cold would receive measurable thermal benefit." Asked him to reverse the framing. I asked what proximity did to the human. He said nothing. The human's thermoregulatory system does not notice. I asked him what proximity did to Veth's skin in conditions where the human was exerting. Elevated output, perspiration active, the full metabolic broadcast running. He pulled up imaging data. He showed me the surface temperature readings from the human's forearm during light exertion, 38.6 degrees. He showed me what Veth dermal tissue begins to experience at sustained contact with a 38-degree surface. It is not catastrophic, it is slow. It is the kind of thermal stress that a Veth registers as heat discomfort, then heat exposure, then, if contact is maintained, as something the medical charts list under a category I had previously associated exclusively with industrial accidents. I thought about my escort officer. 90 seconds, standard grip. He had thought something was wrong with his hand. Pulled the protocol Terath files. All 22 incidents from the past 11 years. I ran the comparative thermal data. Every prior Terath subject had shown declining surface temperature within the first 2 hours of cell cooling, the body beginning to lose the argument with the ambient air. The human surface temperature across 17 hours had not declined by a single measurable degree. Protocol was not designed as a termination measure. But it had never been tested against a species for whom a 6-degree cell is a mildly cool training environment. Tuvral's written assessment, submitted to the Veth Containment Authority 4 weeks later, contained a passage I have since read several times. He wrote that the human thermal profile presents a persistent environmental hazard to Veth personnel in confined close proximity settings, not through any aggressive act, but through the simple continuous fact of their resting physiology. He wrote that standard issue protective gloves, rated for cold environment protocols, provide adequate insulation for brief contacts, but are not rated for extended escort or restraint of a thermally active subject. He wrote that no current Veth containment protocol accounts for a subject whose baseline metabolic output creates a chronic thermal gradient adverse. Handling staff, he wrote, at the end, the risk is not that the human will act. The risk is that the human will simply continue to be warm. Query. 3 days before Tuvral submitted his written report to the Veth Containment Authority's cross-species database, specifically to Records Division that handles inter-station transfer documentation, I asked whether any other stations had filed anomalous thermal contact incident reports involving human detainees. The database returned 11 entries across 7 stations over the prior 4 years. 8 were classified as instrument error and closed without follow-up. 2 were listed under staff medical claims attributed to faulty protective equipment. 1, from Kolvar 3, a sister station in the outer registry, had been filed correctly, with full thermal data, and had sat in the authority's pending review queue for 14 months without being opened. Flagged all 11 for formal review. The authority acknowledged receipt. I re-rated the human's containment classification the following week. The new protocol includes thermal insulated handling gear, reduced direct contact escort duration, and a note in the classification summary that took me 3 drafts to word correctly. I needed language that would be understood by any warden receiving this detainee in transfer. Language that conveyed the nature of the hazard, without making it sound like the hazard was the human's intention, because it is not. She does not know she does it. She runs at 37 degrees the way a river runs downhill. Because it is the only thing her body knows how to do, stopping is not an option it has ever been given. The note, as filed, reads, Detainee presents chronic passive thermal hazard to Veth physiology staff in direct contact. Maintain insulated handling at all times. Do not cycle cell temperature below 10 degrees Celsius. Protocol Tarath inapplicable. Subject physiologically unresponsive to cold reduction measures. I reviewed it twice and submitted it. The station's medical officer asked me, privately, what I was going to do about the existing protocol Tarath log entries. The ones that predated the assessment, that listed the initial cell reduction as a compliance measure. I told him I was going to leave them exactly as they were, because they were accurate in the way that instrument errors are accurate. The protocol was applied. The ambient temperature reached the target. The cell held the reading. What the log does not say, because no one thought to put a field in the form for it, is what the detainee was doing at hour 17. She was doing push-ups. That is the part that stays with me. Not the thermal differential. Not the officers in the medical bay. Not the 3 calibration runs on Tuvral's array. Not the classification change. Not the new protocol language. Not the form I had to file with the containment authority explaining why a species I had flagged as Class 2, non-elevated risk now required specialist handling. The push-ups. The small flat discs of ice on the cell floor, arranged in a perfect oval. Body had been warm enough to sweat, and the floor had been cold enough to freeze it, and she had kept going because the cold had not given her any reason to stop. I have been running this station for 11 years. I have, it turns out, been doing so without a field in my intake forms for what happens when the cold is not a threat. I added the field.